You've probably heard the story of American soldiers in World War II, the greatest fighting force the world had ever seen, strong, disciplined, unbreakable. And somewhere inside that story, inside that mythology that Hollywood has sold us for decades, there was a belief so dark, so twisted, that the government buried it for 50 years. The belief that white American soldiers were not just better trained, not just better equipped, but biologically, at a cellular level, superior to every other race on the planet. Scientists inside the United States military genuinely believed, and wrote this down in official documents, that a white American soldier could survive conditions that would kill any other man on Earth, that they could withstand extreme cold, extreme heat, starvation, thirst, that their bodies were built differently, engineered by nature for endurance that no other human being could match. Some researchers even theorized that a white soldier could survive without water for periods that would be physically impossible for anyone else, that their pain tolerance was beyond anything science had documented, that in World War II, when they finally tested these theories, the results would change military strategy forever. But here is what they did not put in the history books. Here is what stayed locked inside classified files for half a century. To test this theory, to prove white soldiers were superhuman, they needed a comparison. They needed other men, men they could expose to the worst conditions imaginable, men whose suffering would serve as the measuring stick, and they found those men inside their own army. They found them by looking at the color of their skin. This is not a conspiracy theory. Everything I am about to tell you comes directly from declassified United States government documents, from survivors who spent decades trying to get someone, anyone, to listen, from an investigation so explosive that it won a Peabody Award. And yet, most Americans have never heard this story, so let me tell it. It is 1942. America has just entered World War II. Hundreds of thousands of young men are being drafted every single month. Black men, white men, Latino men, Japanese American men, all of them putting on the uniform, swearing an oath, showing up to serve. And here is the cruel irony that nobody talks about. These black soldiers, these men who were fighting for a country that still had segregated schools, segregated restaurants, segregated everything, they showed up anyway. They believed in America. They trusted their government, and that trust was about to be weaponized against them. Imagine you are a 19-year-old black soldier. You have gone through basic training. You are proud. You are ready. And then one day your commanding officer pulls you aside and tells you that you have been selected for a special assignment, a critical mission. You feel honored. You feel chosen. What they do not tell you, what they will never tell you, is that this special mission has nothing to do with fighting the enemy. It has everything to do with being used as a human guinea pig by the very government you just swore to protect. This is where my investigation begins. In the early 1940s, the U.S. military launched a series of secret chemical warfare experiments. On the surface, the stated goal was simple: develop better protective gear against chemical weapons. The threat was real. Chemical warfare was a genuine concern. But when you dig into the actual records, the internal memos, the research notes, the experiment design documents, a very different picture emerges. These experiments were not just about protection. They were about something far more disturbing. Military scientists had developed a theory rooted in the same scientific racism that was supposedly driving America's enemies overseas. The theory was this: different races had different biological tolerances to chemical agents. And specifically, white soldiers might have a natural biological advantage that could be exploited on the battlefield. Now I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because I know what you are thinking. You are thinking that sounds like something the Nazis would believe, and you are right. That is exactly what the Nazis believed. The same ideology that America was sending its soldiers across the ocean to destroy. That ideology was alive and funded and operating inside the United States military at the exact same time. And to prove this theory, they needed living, breathing human beings to experiment on. So they built the chambers. Picture what this actually looked like. Sealed rooms, specially constructed. Soldiers were brought in, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. They were told very little. In some cases, they were told nothing at all. And then the gas came through the vents. Mustard gas. One of the most painful chemical agents ever created. The burning started almost immediately. The eyes first, then the throat, then the skin began to blister. Soldiers fell to their knees. They screamed to be let out, and the door did not open. Not until the scientists standing outside, watching through their observation windows, writing in their notebooks, had gotten what they needed. Some soldiers had the chemical agent applied directly to their skin. Patches of mustard gas literally pressed against their arms, their backs, their faces, to measure how deep the damage went, how fast it spread, how much their bodies could take. And the soldiers selected for the most extreme versions of these tests, the sealed chamber experiments, the direct skin exposure tests, were disproportionately black soldiers. Japanese-American soldiers, Puerto Rican soldiers. The white soldiers who participated were largely used as the control group, the baseline, the standard against which everyone else was being measured. Because in the twisted logic of these scientists, white soldiers were the biological ideal. Everyone else was being tested against them. When the experiments ended, these men were sent back to their units. Many were in serious pain. Many had chemical burns that would never fully heal, lung damage, eye damage, skin conditions that would plague them for the rest of their lives, and they were directly ordered to say nothing, to tell no one. If they sought medical treatment, they were given a cover story to tell. The official records were falsified. The experiments were classified. And these men, already carrying the weight of serving in a segregated army for a country that treated them as second-class citizens, now had to carry this secret too, alone, in silence. Decades passed, these men grew old. Some tried to get Veterans Administration benefits for the health problems destroying their bodies, the chronic respiratory issues, the skin cancers, the permanent nerve damage. And for years their claims were denied, because officially these experiments had never happened. The records were sealed. The government that had poisoned them had erased the evidence. Veterans who had served their country with honor, who had been deliberately used as test subjects, were being called liars by the very institution that had done this to them. It was not until the 1990s that some of these classified documents were finally released. And when investigative journalists began going through those files, page by page, memo by memo, what they found was staggering. Thousands of soldiers had been used in these experiments. And the racial targeting was not accidental. It was not incidental. It was designed into the experiments from the very beginning. The documents showed clearly that soldiers were segregated by race for specific test protocols. That researchers were deliberately trying to determine whether black physiology, Japanese-American biology, Latino bodies responded differently to chemical agents than white bodies did. This was not a rogue operation. This was funded. This was sanctioned. This was policy. And here is the question that I kept coming back to as I went through these documents. The question that cuts to the absolute core of what this story is really about. These scientists, these military researchers, they were Americans. They were part of a country fighting a war against a regime that was conducting horrific medical experiments on human beings based on theories of racial superiority. At the Nuremberg trials, which came at the end of the war, Nazi doctors were condemned for exactly this kind of experimentation. The entire world looked at what those scientists had done and said, "Never again." This is the ultimate violation of human dignity. And yet, at the exact same moment that America was condemning Nazi racial science, American military scientists were running their own version of it, on their own soldiers. Do you understand the scale of that hypocrisy? Because I am still processing it. There is one veteran whose story I cannot stop thinking about. I will not use his name. I want you to think of him as every man who went through this. He described being brought into a room with other black soldiers. They were not told what the room was. They were not told what was going to happen. The gas came through the vents. He described the burning starting almost immediately. He described soldiers around him collapsing. He described screaming to be released. He described the door not opening. And he carried that memory, that specific memory of screaming and the door not opening, for 50 years before anyone asked him about it. 50 years. And when journalists finally tracked him down and asked him what had happened, he said something that has stayed with me since the moment I read it. He said, "I did not know my government saw me that way. I really did not know." That one line contains everything. The full weight of what it meant to be a black man in 1942, putting on a uniform, believing that service would somehow bridge the gap, would somehow make you equal in the eyes of a country that had never treated you as equal. And then discovering in the most physical and visceral way imaginable that the gap was wider than you had ever dreamed, that even your body was not your own, that even your biology was just data. When the story finally broke publicly, when NPR published its full investigation and went on to win a Peabody Award for it, Congress reacted. There were hearings. There were calls for investigations. The Veterans Administration began granting benefits to some veterans who had been denied for decades. Some of these men, finally in their old age, received acknowledgement that what had been done to them was real. Some of them died before that acknowledgement came. And that gap between the wrong that was done and the reckoning that eventually arrived, that gap measured in years and in lives, that is what I find impossible to look away from. Because this is not just a story about something that happened 80 years ago. This is a story about what happens when an institution decides that some of its people are more expendable than others. When it decides that certain bodies are more available for sacrifice. And what makes this story uniquely painful is that these were not strangers to their government. These were soldiers. Men who were already making the ultimate demonstration of trust, putting their lives on the line for a country that would not even let them drink from the same water fountain as white Americans. And that country took that trust and used it as cover for something monstrous. The deeper I went into this research, the more I understood something uncomfortable about history. The people who did terrible things were not always monsters in the obvious sense. Many of these military scientists genuinely believed they were serving their country. They had convinced themselves that what they were doing was scientifically valid, militarily necessary, morally defensible. The same capacity for institutional self-deception that allows ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil. That is not a relic of the past. That is a human constant. And the reason we need to tell these stories, the reason we need to drag them out of classified files and into the daylight, is not to make anyone feel guilty. It is to understand the mechanisms. To understand how institutions built on ideals of freedom and equality can be corrupted from within by the belief that some lives are worth less than others. These men deserved better. They deserved to serve in an army that saw them as fully human. They deserved immediate medical care. They deserved acknowledgement the moment the experiments ended, not decades later when most of them were already broken or dead. And the overwhelming majority of them never got that. They carried what had been done to them in silence, in pain, in a kind of invisibility that is almost impossible to comprehend. Men who had served their country, who had breathed poison for their country, who had screamed inside sealed rooms for their country, invisible, erased, forgotten. So the next time someone talks to you about the greatest generation, and I say this with genuine respect for everything those men and women sacrificed, remember that the greatest generation was not a single story. Inside that generation were men who were being treated as less than human by the government they were dying for. Remember the sealed rooms. Remember the gas coming through the vents. Remember the door that would not open. Remember 50 years of silence. And remember what that veteran said after half a century had passed. I did not know my government saw me that way. The only way to make sure this never happens again, to anyone, is to refuse to look away from the times when it did. There are still documents from these experiments that have not been fully declassified. There are still questions that have never been answered. There are still families of these men who are searching for the full truth of what was done to their fathers and grandfathers. This story is not closed. It has never been closed. And it will not be closed until every sealed room has been opened and every silenced voice has finally been heard.